Hey guys, Matt here, and this is just going to be a quick short video talking about the relationship between reading ability and listening ability when you're learning a foreign language. So basically, learning to read a foreign language is significantly easier than learning to understand the spoken form of a foreign language. And there may be exceptions if there's a language with a really hard script, but I would say even for languages like Japanese and Chinese, learning to read is still significantly easier than learning to understand the spoken form of the language. And this is because when you're talking about reading, you can take as much time as you need to contemplate what the meaning of a sentence is. You can also easily look up anything you want to look up because the word is right there on the page. Whereas when we're talking about listening, it can be very fast, and so there's kind of the speed limit built in. Also, a lot of times, words are pronounced in a very blurry, kind of slurred way, and sometimes even if you know a word, you just can't make it out. And I have a whole video on this topic called Why You Still Can't Understand Your Target Language, so check that out if you want to learn more. But anyway, in general, learning to read is significantly easier than learning to understand the spoken form of a language. But the other side of this is that once you already have a certain level of reading ability, learning to transfer that over into listening ability isn't actually that difficult. Pretty much just by spending time listening to your target language, you'll slowly become able to hear all those things that you're already able to read. And so because of this, the most efficient way to go about achieving both a strong level of reading ability and listening ability is first to initially focus on cultivating reading ability, and then after that go and trying to just transfer that over into listening ability. Basically what this means is that you're pushing your cutting edge of vocabulary and grammar knowledge forward through reading, and then when you're listening, you're pretty much just playing catch up. And this is basically what I did when I learned Japanese, and I think it's the most efficient way to learn a foreign language. Now, the question is, how far are you willing to let your listening abilities lag behind your reading abilities? Because if the gap between your reading and listening abilities is too large, there are some negative consequences. For example, first of all, if you get to the point where you can read quite comfortably, but your listening abilities are still very poor, then that's going to make the act of practicing listening very tedious because you're going to be used to understanding everything. And then when you go and try to understand a TV show with no subtitles or something, you're going to understand so little that it's going to be like kind of an ego hit. It's just going to be jarring, and you might start just avoiding the act of watching without subtitles or just doing raw listening because it's so jarring to not understand. And then because of this, you never actually catch up your listening ability to your reading ability. So this is one potential downside. There's also the potential danger of harming your pronunciation in the long term, because when you're reading and you don't have a high level of listening ability, you don't really know how the language is supposed to be pronounced, and so you're kind of making up pronunciations in your head, and this can lead you to have pretty funky pronunciation. And I've met a lot of people who have learned, for example, Japanese or learned English largely through reading, and their pronunciation tends to be a little poor. So basically, we have this kind of trade-off where the most efficient path is to focus extremely heavily on reading and do very little listening, at least until you reach a high point of reading ability, but we might be sacrificing our pronunciation, and also that just might lead you to a point where if the gap is too big, then you might end up just avoiding doing listening at all because it will be so jarring. So in order to balance these two, I think it's good to have a 7-to-3 ratio, with the 7 being reading and 3 being listening in the beginning of the process. So this is talking about your active immersion. You can always do more listening passively, and I recommend doing so. But at the beginning of the process, I recommend spending 70% of your time reading the language and then 30% listening. And I think that's going to be good balance. And then once you get to the point in a certain domain where you're able to understand almost everything that you read, then you want to kind of reverse that ratio and start spending 70% of your time listening so that you can catch your listening up to close to where your reading is going to be. Ultimately, your reading ability is always going to be better just because it is so much inherently easier. And even for me in English, I think my reading ability is better than my listening ability, because when I watch a movie without any subtitles, there might be 1 or 2 lines where I just miss what was said because it was kind of blurry or something. Whereas when I watch with subtitles, I generally understand 100%. So your reading is always going to be at least a little bit better than your listening, but of course you want to have at least a decent level of listening ability so that you can have conversations and watch movies without subtitles and things like that. One little final note that I'll add is that in my view, when you're watching shows with target language subtitles, although that is a combination of both listening and reading, I think that it's closer to reading than it is to listening, because a lot of times what happens is you end up just focusing entirely on the subtitles and kind of just zoning out the audio. And so for the purposes of just thinking pragmatically about how you're spending your time, I think it's okay to categorize watching with target language subtitles as time spent reading. And watching with target language subtitles is a really good way to get familiar with text early on in the process, because when you're a beginner, trying to read a full text medium like a book is pretty unrealistic unless it's something kind of created for a learner or something made for children or something like that. So I do recommend making use of audiovisual content with target language subtitles, but once you start to get to a more advanced level, it's good to also spend a lot of time reading actual books, because ultimately the process of watching shows with target language subtitles, although it is very similar to reading, it isn't reading, and to develop real strong listening abilities, you have to actually spend time reading. So that was all for this video. Hopefully that was useful to you guys. If you did find this video useful, then please like it, subscribe to the channel, follow me on Twitter, and check out the Mass Immersion Approach Patreon, where we have lots of cool exclusive content that hopefully will improve your language learning experiences. So that's all for me, and thanks so much for watching.